Is that thing on? Probably think there's protein in this shaker. There's not. Just coffee. I'm gonna scoot my ass forward and smash into the desk just like that. That's really good. Testing, testing. Hi, hello, how are you? My name's Tyler. If you haven't seen me before, that's not really important. But last time I made a video like this, my first watch video, it was really well received. I got a lot of comments from a lot of really passionate watch guys. I just wanted to say, if you are a returning viewer, I really appreciate you stopping by to watch. Now, I've noticed both before owning and after having owned this watch for a while, there just aren't really that many good videos out there on YouTube about the Alpine Eagle. I'm going to do my very best to be as discerning and meticulous as I always am, and try essentially to make the sort of video that I wished existed when I was considering the purchase myself. Before I can do that, though, a few disclaimers. Number one, watches are not good investments. Two, nobody really needs a watch these days. We all carry around cell phones. If you did buy a watch, it doesn't have to be something expensive at all. Three, nobody really cares about your watch. You will. Maybe some choice few friends who are also really nerdy about it might, but for the most part, nobody's going to notice, nobody's going to care. Four, because of all that, as long as you aren't hurting yourself or anyone else and you're being financially responsible, you should do what makes you happy. And if that means wasting obscene amounts of money on watches, have at it. The year was 2024. At that point, I'd been collecting watches for a couple of years, maybe 3 years. My 30th birthday was coming up, so Christine and I planned a trip to one of our favorite cities. And important to note that I was definitely not planning on buying a watch. Famous last words, right? Now, by this time, I had definitely developed a sort of taste or preference toward integrated bracelet watches, but I also really preferred subtlety. I don't like the feeling of, say, like when I did own a Rolex, I didn't like the feeling of thinking to myself, I don't know if this was ever really true, but thinking that other people would look at the watch on my wrist and think that it either looked really fancy and or that they would know what it is and know how much it's worth. Just something about that doesn't sit right with me. I had seen the Alpine Eagle in pictures and video and once in person, and I'd always thought that the 41mm case size was a bit too large for a watch like this. All that said, this time, this visit was different. The person that we met, Melissa, shout out to Melissa, she's probably one of the best salespeople that we've ever dealt with. She was very patient. She had no problem with us looking at like everything in the store if we really wanted to. And there was no apparent rush. There was no feeling like she or anyone in the store was trying to suss out whether or not we were buyers on that day. So anyway, I tried on the watch for the second time. And because the first time was a bit rushed, there's a handful of little things that I didn't really notice the first go around. But I did notice this time. One was that the watch did look extraordinarily bright, even compared to the other watch that I had on my wrist. Two, it wore much smaller to me than 41mm. And three, they had it changed from the original clasp. Originally, what they had was a friction fit clasp, but this current model had a dual trigger to point clasp. All these little things are things that I noticed, and I will circle back to them later in this review, but just things that stuck out to me then. Now, you remember how I said that I wasn't going to buy a watch on this trip? Well, for context, we had been working really, really hard for many years at this point. I've done the math. I had worked nearly double full time for almost 10 years at that point, trying my hardest to make things work, build businesses, and we did all of the financially responsible things that we were supposed to. I don't know if this will make the final cut of this video, but another really special moment like this was shortly after my birthday. It was her birthday. Same sort of trip, same place actually. And I remember I got her this handmade music box because at home, she didn't really have a place to store her jewelry, like what little jewelry she had. We just kind of kept in the safe. And the idea was I surprised her with this music box, and she was already really happy with that. That would have been fine if that was her only present. But we actually went on a little shopping spree and we got, a few pieces of jewelry for her that she had been eyeing for a while. And just as well, just like me purchasing this watch, what I'm getting at is both of these memories and that time in our life felt like a period of celebration, of being sure that we had done well enough, that we had worked hard enough, that we were allowed to spoil ourselves every once in a while. On to the unboxing. I would say that this is not necessarily the pinnacle, but it is unique, and this is a thoughtful design. What we have here is this wooden box. The wood is actually MDF, which is like, really fancy particle board, but it has been veneered with what appears to be solid wood, and everything has been stained the same sort of dark or medium gray color. On the top of the box, you have this inlaid metal compass rose. The compass rose motif is something that means something to me. You'll notice that if you've seen any of the North Star stuff. On the front there, we have a metal inlaid Chopard and a metal closure button. On the interior of the box, everything is lined in this black velvet, and what you have is this very oversized watch pillow. This is long enough that you can actually put 3 watches on it. Ask me how I know. I believe what they were doing with this is they were making a box that they thought the owner may actually use for storage of watches or display of watches. And this one actually does live on my desk most of the time. So while I definitely have enjoyed this box and I've gotten a lot of use out of it, I wouldn't say it's on par with the lacquered wood boxes of Audemar Piguet or Patek Philippe, but this is certainly much, much better than something like Cartier or Rolex. Real quick, this video is brought to you by North Star. North Star is a company that my fiance and I started mainly because I was shopping for high quality basic garments of this particular style. I was paying a lot of money for them anyway, and I was generally dissatisfied with what I was buying. So we started thinking that maybe, given some of my experience, I could try to do it myself. And we did. It took a really long time to come to fruition, but we're really happy with what we're producing. And I know there's probably not a whole lot of crossover between that sort of style and the watch world. But if you guys want to support the channel, that is probably one of the best ways to do so, if not totally cool as well. We do donate a portion of our profits to St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital. So maybe it's a way to support the channel. It's a way to do something nice. And if that's your jam, it's a way to get some cool new clothes. What do we get with the Alpine Eagle? So 41 millimeter diameter, nominal. I will come back to that. 9.7 millimeters thick, so actually quite thin. 100 meter water resistance with a screw down crown. 60 hours power reserve from a COSC certified chronometer movement. They do use their own proprietary alloy of something they call A223 Lucent Steel. They say this is 70% recycled material. They claim 50% greater abrasion resistance than 316 and 904L, which are the more commonly used stainless steels in watchmaking. Lucent steel undergoes a secondary smelting process, essentially creating a metal that is of higher purity and as a result, higher brilliance. So you essentially have more light refraction off of the surface of the metal. A little bit of lore about me. I, for like 5 or 6 years, ran a materials tech company where in our industry, it was extremely commonplace for, every year, other companies would come out with new materials, new alloys, new composites. They would trademark and patent and create new marketing material, all for it to end up being a bunch of nothing. It was the same material they were already using, changed by, a molecule or something. Nothing that actually resulted in any appreciable difference in performance. So I'm kind of skeptical about things like this, but Lucent Steel does not seem to be one of those cases. In my experience, it really is what they say it is. Now, this design is a very interesting backstory. It's essentially the revival of the Saint Moritz, which was first created by Carl Friedrich Soufflet, who is the current president of Chopard. Carl Friedrich Soufflet's son, Carl Fritz Soufflet, he is now their head of operations, I believe. And one of his first big projects was actually convincing his dad, and I'm sure some board, that they should bring back the Saint Moritz as Chopard's entry into the integrated bracelet sports watch market. And it's a damn good thing that they did, because as far as I can tell, the Alpine Eagle is really what kind of brought Chopard back into vogue, at least on the watchmaking front. I know people have known about them as a jewelry house for ages, and they probably always will be known as that first and foremost. But clearly, their watchmaking capability flew under the radar for a very long time. But the Alpine Eagle being what it is and competing in that market that is so crowded definitely drew a lot of attention to Chopard. The dial is made of this stamped brass that creates this really interesting swirl texture that looks almost organic. The color of the dial is produced by galvanic treatment that results in this case, kind of a muted metallic color. The same is true of their green and their gray dials, but it can create a very vibrant metallic in other colors like their Monte Rosa, like their maritime blue. This dial is meant to evoke the iris of an eagle, hence the name of the watch. And an interesting note, the Chaufflet family actually established a nonprofit dedicated to preserving the ecosystems and reintroducing endangered eagle species to the wild years ago. And after the success of the Alpine Eagle, they actually renamed that foundation the Alpine Eagle Foundation. You have Roman numerals at 12, 3, 6, and 9. While that is kind of an interesting choice, I do think it results in very good symmetry and excellent spacing on the dial. It doesn't look too crowded, but it also doesn't look like you are just staring at a blank canvas. I know a lot of people would say that the date wheel at 430 is a very bold choice, and they're right, but this is really well executed. The date wheel is color matched well enough that you don't really notice it until you're looking for the date. The lume is sufficient for a watch of this sort. It's nothing to write home about, but it is there. The hands and indices are impeccably finished. The counterweight on the seconds hand is actually beveled to resemble the feather of, you guessed it, an eagle. One thing that really stands out about this that you may not notice unless you own one of these is the anti-reflective treatment on the sapphire here, second to none. I've seen and played with more watches than I can count. I do not know of a single watch that has a better anti-reflective treatment. I am not joking or exaggerating when I say that from most viewing angles, you really can't tell that there's a sapphire there at all. The porthole case is a very classic design choice, but everything else here is not. What you have is a moderately wide bezel affixed by functional screws. On the outside, what you look down at on your wrist, these screws are arranged symmetrically, and they are actually tightened from the underside. The width of this bezel does a great job of balancing the proportions of the watch. Essentially, wider bezel means you have a smaller diameter dial, which makes the watch as a whole appear slightly smaller on your wrist. You have these polished crown guards protecting an oversized crown that features that same compass rose motif. The crown guards are actually mirrored on the opposite side of the case. This is super satisfying to look at. I think that they could have gone wrong. If they shaped or sized these flanks even the slightest bit differently, it would look a bit too derivative of a Nautilus. But the way they have done this still looks like its own thing, does not look too much like anything else that I've seen. And the symmetry is so satisfying. Now, I mentioned earlier that they call this a 41 millimeter watch, but the only place that this actually measures 41 millimeters across is going to be across these crown guards. If you measure it from here to here on the opposite flank, that is 41. If I were to measure across the round or circular section of the case, so say from this corner across to this corner, that is only 39.5 millimeters. So despite the fact that they call this a 41 millimeter case, the proportionality here is of a considerably smaller watch. Then, of course, you have these extensions of the case at the top and bottom that integrate seamlessly into the bracelet. And man, this bracelet really makes the watch. I've never seen anything else quite like it. What you have here is these ingot-style links with a polished center and longitudinal brushing, as well as polished bevels. Each link is attached to the next by this intermediate piece. It kind of looks like a figure 8 on this side view if you look very carefully. But these parts are machined so precisely that you can hardly see the gaps. And then on the underside of the links, there is a single screw that runs through to the polished centerpiece, the centerpiece acting like a nut to hold everything together. Now, this is unusual, but it does make for an easier sizing experience than most watches if you are brave enough to do it yourself. Now, the clasp I mentioned earlier, I'm a little bit unsure about this now after seeing some of their recent pictures. If you go to their website, for example, it makes it look like they've returned to the old friction fit deployant clasp, which that just seemed in the first place when they released the watch. And if they switched back, that seems crazy to me to have a watch that is this expensive and this valuable to not have a trigger system by which the clasp can kind of lock on your wrist. But for the past handful of years at least, and again, I'm not sure about current production, but they did switch at some point to this twin trigger deployant system. Now, if you own one of these watches, or if you've watched enough videos and you are extremely detail oriented, you might have already caught on that this is not the original bracelet. This is actually from the new Alpine Eagle XPS Mountain Glow. The key differences between the original bracelet and the new XPS bracelet are that the original bracelet tapered from the case 23 millimeters thereabouts down to 20. So not a whole lot of taper there. The new bracelet tapers down to 18 millimeters, and most of that reduction in width occurs within the first 5 links off of the case, which means that most of the links on like the side of your wrist and all of the links on the underside of your wrist are going to be that narrower 18 mil width. The other big change is that at the clasp, you have on both sides, on the fly, integrated microadjust. So it's just a pull and it pops out on either side. You have 2 millimeters. I'm kind of a weirdo about this, but I feel very strongly that all watches should have on the fly micro adjustment. It's not that hard. It's not like an incredible feat of engineering that they're doing when they have this feature added, but especially at this price point, it makes such a significant difference in finding the correct fit and comfort throughout the day as your wrist changes in size that I feel like it's kind of inexcusable not to include that feature. Now, I did ask, but I did not get an official answer from Chopard. Clearly, the bracelet from the XPS is compatible to all the 41 millimeter Alpine Eagles. Based on the product description for their XPS and their other precious metal Alpine Eagles that do share the same sort of updated bracelet, it doesn't seem like they're planning on rolling this out to all of the Alpine Eagles. They claim that it was meant to enhance the proportionality of the thinner XPS, which, okay, I guess, but it sounds like it's just a way for them to reserve this for the more exclusive and much more expensive models in their line. If you do inquire about it, just be prepared. You will pay a large sum of money, like new watch money. After taxes and shipping and everything, I believe it was close to $6,000. The movement is not the star of the show here. It's not bad, but it's pretty industrial in the subtlety of its finishing. I would honestly say that I have some tool watches, like my Seamaster, that have nicer looking movements for much less money. That said, this movement is chronometer certified and actually has been my most accurate watch. More than other chronometers, more than Rolex's superloaded chronometer, and even more than a Geneva hallmark movement. 60 hours of power reserve, to me, for a watch like this, that's plenty. Given the choice, I would almost always rather see, down to a limit of about 40 hours, I'd almost rather see a thinner movement in a thinner case than I would more power reserve at the cost of making the watch thicker. This movement does feature hacking seconds and winds smoothly. It doesn't have that kind of cheap, frustrating feeling that some movements do have. Think about like most of the common Sellita movements. I think it's excusable for a movement that is that economical, but on a watch like this, it just wouldn't feel right. The oversized crown also is kind of a nice touch. I think without the crown guards, it would look out of proportion. With the crown guards, it looks totally fine there. But having an oversized crown is really nice when it's time to wind the watch. It just allows you to get a little bit more purchase as you wind it. When it comes to living with and wearing this watch, I wouldn't say that the original bracelet made it uncomfortable, but seeing that it had no micro adjustment, no half links, and it was 20 millimeters all the way through, I basically was stuck where I'd either wear it a little bit too loose, where the watch could essentially slide past my wrist bone nearer to my hand, and that is like a particular pet peeve of mine, or I would wear the watch one link smaller, which was always a bit snug, and then if ever I ate too much sodium, or if it was really warm outside and my wrist started to swell, it would make it where, like, as I bent my wrist, it would feel like it's restricting the movement of my wrist into extension and flexion. That said, with the original and certainly with the updated bracelet, it's always sat very, very flat to my wrist. That has a lot to do with the case thickness of only 9.7 mil, which again is pretty phenomenal for what you're getting out of this watch. I think the lug to lug here is reasonable for an integrated bracelet design. In order to kind of contextualize or help you maybe envision accurately the size of this watch, I would call this a 39.5 or 40 millimeter watch. I wouldn't really consider it a 41. And to me, I have a 7.25 inch wrist. I think this is the perfect size, the most perfect size of a watch. Now, I do wear watches as large as 42 millimeters, quite a bit thicker. And I could go a little bit smaller, I think. But for me, this has definitely been my favorite size, favorite proportions. For comparison's sake, I have tried like a Girard-Perregaux Laureato in 38 mil, and I have found that to be quite a bit too small. I've also tried an Audemar Piguet 41 millimeter Royal Oak, which I thought was gigantic. So this strikes a good balance of not just nominal size, but also proportionality, where it just looks at home on my wrist. And if you are considering one and you're worried that it might be too big, I'd consider at least trying one on, seeing what you think, because you might be surprised that it doesn't wear as large as it might seem. The upgraded bracelet kind of makes this watch everything I'd ever hoped that it could be. The more aggressive taper makes the watch feel much more elegant on the wrist. Before, it kind of felt almost like a cuff type of bracelet. The micro adjustment is exactly what micro adjustment should be. The way that they do it, it's so subtle. When it is in either position, inward or outward, you don't really notice it at all unless you're really looking for it. You can adjust it whether you already have the watch on your wrist or off, doesn't really matter. And it is quite secure when it's adjusted in whatever position you'd like it to be in. I have found the combination of little changes with the bracelet update to allow me to find the perfect fit, such that when I'm wearing the watch, I kind of just forget that it's on my wrist. The appearance of this watch is really why I fell in love with it. I would say that the case and bracelet finishing are on par with, maybe even better than some of the Holy Trinity watches that I've handled. This may actually have something to do with their Lucent Steel alloy having that higher degree of light refraction. There really is something to that. But I'll compare these two. And while Vacheron is also extremely good and extremely well known for their uncompromising dedication to finishing, I would still have to say the Chopard bracelet here is better. It almost looks more like white gold than it does steel. Audemar Piguet is in a class of its own when it comes to bracelet finishing, so I don't think that the Chopard is quite at that level, but I would comfortably say that it is better than any Nautilus, it is better than any Overseas, it is better than the 222. Now, before you come for me in the comments, I'm not talking about movement finishing. I know that Patek Philippe and Vacheron especially are in a league of their own when it comes to both movement and movement finishing. I'm just talking about the bracelet and case. The result of all this is a watch that is eye-catching. With this navy blue dial, I think it's balanced. The case and bracelet being as brilliant as they are, it is a bit flashy. And I think that had I gone with a more bright metallic dial, like the Maritime Blue, like the Monte Rosa, like the Mountain Glow, it would make the entire watch flashy. And it'd be a bit too much for me. They're more run-of-the-mill colors. Your blue, your green, your gray. These are more muted. They're something that you as the owner will look down on your wrist and really be able to appreciate the unique texture and finish of the dial, but nobody else will really give it much thought. Now, without doing a deliberate scratch test, I believe I can still confirm that this bracelet, or actually what I'll do is I'll show you the original bracelet because I've had that on the watch for about 2 years. The kind of life that I live, I'm most likely to scratch the watch near the clasp, and you don't really see too much of that. If you care about recognition, a small handful of people have asked me about this watch. There's only ever been 2 who recognize it as an Alpine Eagle, and both of those guys were salesmen in watch boutiques. So I kind of think the expectation is that they would know more about watches in general. The only other time that I've seen somebody wearing an Alpine Eagle out in the world was at a Chopard boutique or a Chopard event. So they're not that common. And when I have seen somebody else wearing one, the thought that crossed my mind was, wow, that guy could have bought something else, but maybe he didn't want people to know how much he spent, or maybe he just really fell in love with the design and he made a choice that was uniquely his own. Or maybe that's what I think about myself buying this watch, and that's why I think of that about the other guy, the only two people who I've ever seen wear the same watch. The current MSRP for their non-limited dial variants is 17,000 US dollars. You can find the more common dials, new or close to new, between 12 and 14 on the gray market. Some of the limited or discontinued variants do still sell well over list. That said, the value proposition here is kind of tricky. Based on the combination of technical specification and design, I would say that this punches well above its weight class. There are not many watches that are in the same sort of category. I would compare this to something like the Girard-Perregaux Laureato. I would compare it to the IWC Ingenieur, or perhaps the new Formex Aria. I've never handled a Formex, but I have handled the Laureato and the Ingenieur plenty. And I'll say that in every way, this is a better watch by miles than those two. The problem that Chopard may create for themselves as they try to push this watch up market is that they're getting dangerously close to the price point of a 15550 or 15500 ST Royal Oak or the 4520V Vacheron Overseas. Those watches in steel, assuming you had a chance to buy them at retail, would still fetch a much higher price than this watch. Let's assume that if you bought a Vacheron, you went with a blue dial Overseas, because why would you not? And if you went with an AP, it actually wouldn't really matter which of the dials you got. But any of those watches, if purchased at retail, and you one day decided that you didn't need to keep it or you wanted to move on from it, you would make at least a few thousand. With the Alpine Eagle, you'd be losing at least a few $1,000s, possibly more. As the price closes in on like the $20,000 range, value retention becomes a significant consideration for buyers in that market. What this means to me is that if you're the type of guy who's going to buy a watch, enjoy it for a bit, and sell it so you can move on to something else, this is pretty bad value. On the other hand, if you are so in love with the design that you think you would want to wear this watch forever, you'd never sell it, you'd wear it until you died, you'd pass it on to your kids, then for this watch or any other watch, there's no such thing as bad value. All right, guys, that's it for this one. Thank you again for joining me, for spending so much time watching me, indulging me in my nerdiness. If you guys have any questions, drop them down below in the comments, and I will do my best to respond to every single one. I'll see you guys next time. Peace.